Now that we are redirecting the user around the application as they log in and log out, we also want to make sure that if they are navigating between routes, they do have the correct authentication for that route. Now, currently, if I'm on the login page and I click Create Expense, it brings me over to this page, no questions asked, even if I'm not logged in. And obviously, that is a problem. To address this problem, the first thing we have to do is store something in Redux related to user authentication. So in our case, we're going to keep track of whether or not the user is logged in, and we're going to do that by storing the user ID somewhere in the Redux store. So we have access to the user ID via a property on user right here. We can view that by using console.log. I'm going to print the string UID, followed by, as the second argument, the actual value. That is user.uid. This stores the user's ID. And if we go ahead and save things as they currently stand, we'll actually be able to view this value in the console. The application is going to refresh. I'm going to click login. I am going to log in with one of my accounts. And once I do go through that process, I should see my unique user ID printing. Right here, I do indeed have that value. So this is the value that we want to store in Redux. We can then use that value throughout the application to figure out if we're logged in, if so, as who, or to figure out if we're not logged in which case UID wouldn't be defined. That means what we're going to be doing is creating a brand new reducer. We're going to create a reducer for authentication. I'm going to head over to the source reducers directory, and inside of there we have our two current ones. I'm going to add a new one, auth.js. That'll be the new authentication reducer. And I'm also going to be adding some new actions into auth. So we'll crack this file open as well. And we can actually get started with the reducer. So the reducer is just going to be the pure function exactly as it was in the past. So I can export by default some function. And the big picture goal here is to just have this reducer handle those two actions, one for logging in and one for logging out. Don't forget, we have to provide our default state right here. And for our purposes, we're going to set state up to be an object. We'll add a property onto that object when the user is logged in, and we will wipe that object back to an empty object when the user logs out. Now you might say, why not just store the user ID as the state? You could do that, but I'm going to store it on a property in case I ever want to store other things later on. Right here, all I need to do is set up action. This is the action that is getting dispatched. And now we can handle those two cases. I'm going to switch based off of the action type. Now we need to handle our two cases as well as the default case. For the case of login, what are we going to do? What we're going to do is return the new state, which is going to be an object. On that object, we are going to define UID, and we're going to get the value from action.uid. So when I dispatch login, I have to pass the UID along so I can actually set something. Down below, we're going to add the logout case logout. And in the case of a logout action being dispatched, I'm just going to return an empty object. Down below, we can add a default case, default. This one is just going to return the current state value. So if it's not a login action and it's not a logout action, this reducer does not care. Now, if we are going to have these two reducer actions set up, we should probably go ahead and define those over here. I'm going to create login and logout. Export const login. Login is going to need to take an argument, the UID, and we're going to set it up to implicitly return an object. This is going to be the action object, and all we need is the type and the UID property set. Type of login, UID property equal to the UID argument. And we can do the exact same thing for logout. Export const logout. This one doesn't even need an argument. All we have to do is return implicitly the correct object, and we don't need anything but the type of logout. So we have these actions in place. We have the reducer in place. All we really need to do is connect the reducer to the Redux store and actually dispatch log in and log out when appropriate. I'm going to connect the reducer to the store down below. We have our store directory. In there, we have configure store, and this is where we currently set everything up. I'm going to grab our other reducer. Whoops, it looks like in the past I added a third-party import after my built-in ones. In general, it's a good practice to toss your third-party imports first, then have your own. Right here, I'm going to import the Auth Reducer from the file that we just created. I'm going to go out of this directory into the reducers folder, In there, I have the new one, auth.js. Now we can just tack it on. So I'm going to set up a new auth property on the Redux state, and it will be managed by the Auth Reducer. Perfect. The reducer is all set up, which means we can actually close down this file for the moment. And what we're going to focus on is dispatching login and log out in app.js. So we want to dispatch login after the user is actually logged in, and we're going to dispatch log out after they have successfully logged out. This is going to make sure that we always have the most up-to-date information in the store. We have the ID if they're logged in, and we have nothing if they're not. Now, if we are going to dispatch those things, we should probably import them, and up above, we can go ahead and get that done. Inside of here, we do have start set expenses. Start set expenses is getting used, but we also have set text filter. Set text filter is no longer getting used, so I'm just going to replace this import for the new one. I'm going to be grabbing two named exports. That would be login and log out, and I'm going to grab them not from the filters action file, but from the auth action file. Perfect. Now that we have login and log out, all we got to do is dispatch them. Down below, I'm going to dispatch login right here. This is the first time we really know the user has indeed logged in. I can use store.dispatch to get that done. I am going to dispatch the login action, passing in the user.uid property, making sure that actually does get stored. Then down below, we're going to go ahead and log out. I'll log out right here by dispatching using store.dispatch log out. And a log out can get called with no arguments since the action generator takes none. Now we can actually save app.js and check things out over in the browser. Over in the browser, I'm going to use the Redux developer tools to keep track of changes to the state, and I will shift those over to the right-hand side so I have a little more space. Right here, you can see we were logged in, and the appropriate actions did get fired. We have login showing up, we have the user ID getting stored, which is great. Then we had set expenses, and our expenses are getting set. If I do go ahead and log out, we also see the log out event fire, and the auth.uid property gets wiped. So everything is working well so far. And this is an important step because now we have a way to know whether or not we're authenticated from other places in our code as opposed to just inside of this callback. Now, a lot of students usually ask, why are we dispatching login inside of onAuth state changed as opposed to dispatching it somewhere inside of start login, like we've done for our other asynchronous actions? Well, remember, it's important to put that code inside of here because this callback is also going to run when a user first visits the web page. So when a user does visit the web page, this automatically triggers. It lets us know if we're logged in or logged out, and we can make sure the Redux store is up to date. If we only dispatched login and log out from inside of our asynchronous actions, the values would only ever get set or cleared when someone explicitly logged in or logged out, as opposed to when they're implicitly logged in by just loading the application after having been logged in before. Now that's where we're going to stop for this video in terms of new features. What I would like to do before we go though is add a test case for log out. We're going to add one for log in, and we're going to add one for our reducer, making sure that logging in and logging out do work correctly. So that's going to be a total of 4 test cases, one for login, one for log out. Over here, one for login, one for log out. Now getting these done is going to be your challenge, so you're going to need to create the correct companion test files and add the test cases based off of how we've tested these things in the past. We've already tested action generators, we've already tested reducers, so if you forget how to get that done, you can always refer to the code we've written in the past. Take some time to write those 4 test cases, actually run the test suite and make sure they all pass, then you can go ahead and click play. All right, nothing too bad there. I'm going to start off with the Auth Reducer, then I'll move on to the Auth Actions. Let's create a test file for that reducer in the tests reducers directory. Right here, auth.test.js. And inside of here, we're going to start by importing the reducer. Import Auth Reducer, the default export, and we're going to grab that from the file. Once to get out of the tests reducer folder, then to get out of the tests directory. From there, we're looking for reducers. And in reducers, we want auth. Now we can actually write those test cases. We're going to add 2. I'll add a couple of calls to test right here. And I can start them off as empty calls, and I'll just duplicate it. take those lines, copy them down below, and we're going to create 2. So the first test case we're going to create will be something along the lines of should set UID for login, and the second one will be should clear UID for log out. If both of those work, we know the reducer is working as expected. Now you might have also added a third test case to test the default value. That's really up to you. Since the default is an empty object, you could really go either way. Now let's go ahead and actually write the test cases for the reducer. Right here, we're going to call the reducer with those values. We're going to call it with the state and with the action we're trying to dispatch. So right here, I will set up the action, const action. This will be an object with type equal to login and a UID value of whatever we like. I'm going to go with the string ABC123. So we have our action object. Now we need to actually pass it through the reducer. I'm going to use const state to get the new state back. I'm going to call the reducer, that is Auth Reducer, and I'm going to pass in 2 things. The state, in this case, we can start off with whatever we like. I'll just start off with an empty object, and we're going to pass in the action. And we would expect that the ID is on the returned state since we just dispatched login. Down below, you could have made that assertion, expecting something about state.uid, expecting it to be the exact same value as action.uid. If they are the same, great. If not, we definitely have a problem. Now we could run the test cases now, or we could just knock out the second one first, and that's what I'm going to do. In this one, we're trying to clear the user ID. I'm going to create the new action, const action for this one. That would be a type equal to log out, and there is no need for anything else. Now we can go ahead and see if the data actually gets wiped. I'm going to create a const for state once again. I'm going to call the Auth Reducer, and we're going to pass to it the state. This time we will have a user ID provided, UID of literally anything. Then we're going to go ahead and provide the second argument, which would be the action. So the action object should manipulate that state, removing it, and at the end of the day, I would expect that the state that comes back equals using to equal an empty object. If it is, then everything went well. We can go ahead and run these 2 new test cases by heading over to the terminal. I'm going to shut down the dev server, clear the output, and I will boot things up with yarn test, and I will go ahead and pass watch down to jest. Once that is up, hopefully we do have a completely passing test suite, and if we do, we'll move on to the last test cases, which would be test cases for those actions. Right here, it looks like everything is passing. We have our brand new reducer test file showing up in that list, which is a great step. Let's go ahead and create the last test file for this video inside of the tests actions directory. In here, we are going to make auth.test.js to test our authentication related actions. And we just have those 2 actions. The first one, log in, and the second one, log out. We want to make sure that we are getting the correct things back for both. First up, we can test log in. We are going to go ahead and import both of those. Import log in and log out. We're going to grab them from the following path. We need to go up 2 folders, which would bring us to the source directory, into the actions folder, and in there we have auth. Perfect. Down below, we can add those test cases. 1 test case for the first guy, and then I'll duplicate that, another test case for the second one. For the first test case, we can add the following text: should generate login action object. Then down below, should generate log out action object. And we're just going to make some basic assertions about what comes back when we call those 2 functions. We can create a const called action, we can call login, and we can pass in a dummy UID. I'll just stick with mine, ABC123, and all we need to do is make sure it shows up in the output. Now I can always take this and extract it into its own UID variable. Const UID equals that value. I pass it into login, and then I make my assertion, expecting action to equal the following: an object with type equal to login and with UID equal to the UID variable from up above. Now logout is a whole lot easier. All we have to do is create the action. We're going to create the action object by calling logout, and then we're just going to go right to the assertion since it doesn't take any arguments. I'm going to expect action to equal, and right here we're going to go ahead and pass in type of logout. Now, as I mentioned earlier in this course, you're going to find your own flow when it comes to what to test, how often to test, and what sort of test coverage you'd like to have. You might think that testing this is unreasonable and that it's just a waste of time, and that might be true for the moment. But if you get in the habit of avoiding the testing of certain things, those things are most likely going to evolve or get more complex over time, and then you're going to get yourself into a tricky situation. So I do recommend writing these test cases. Even though they are simple, they only take a few seconds to hammer out, and it's just going to make your code base that much better. So now that we have all of this in place and we have a way to know whether or not a user is logged in or logged out, we're going to continue on to the next video where we actually use that information to kick them out of those other pages if they don't have the correct authentication status. That means we'll be moving back over to app.js and app router. I will see you in the next one.